the sound of the heavy oak gavel, did not merely strike the wood. It cleaved the entire room into an unnatural, frozen silence. But it wasn't the gavel that made the air in the county courtroom turn to ice. It was the absolute, structural lack of movement from the bench. Judge Henderson sat perfectly rigid. His face was completely drained of every ounce of its ruddy, small-town color. He looked as though his entire world had been pulled out from under his feet, in a single second. His fingers, which had spent the last 2 hours confidently shuffling through local civil filings, were visibly trembling against the crisp edge of a heavy white document. The document had emerged from an envelope sealed with crimson federal wax, bearing the stark embossed emblem of the Department of Defense. Across the room, my mother, Meredith, leaned closer to her slick attorney, Sterling. She was wearing a silk blouse she couldn't afford. Her lips curved into a sharp, triumphant smile that she had practiced for weeks. In front of her vanity mirror, she looked at me, sitting entirely alone at the defense table, expecting to see the first cracks of humiliation on my face. She expected tears. She expected a daughter broken by public exposure, stripped of her dignity, before the entire county. Instead, the only sound in the massive, high-ceilinged room was the steady, rhythmic hum of the old ceiling fan overhead. It was paired with the faint, dry, tick, tick, tick of the old mechanical Swiss military stopwatch resting on my table. It sliced through the quiet like a metronome, counting down the seconds of an old-world ending. I did not look back at her. I did not shift my weight. I kept my eyes fixed on the pale man behind the bench. I was observing the collapse of their design, with the cold, detached precision of a strategist who had already seen the final move play out, 11 months ago. At that exact millisecond, as the judge's eyes reached the bottom of the page, the mechanical stopwatch cut out completely. Its gears froze into total, absolute silence. Not a single tick remained. Judge Henderson slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back. He did not look at Meredith. He did not look at the local reporters she had gathered in the front row. He looked at me, his chest rising and falling with shallow, terrified breaths. Then, with a stiffness that shocked every local official in the gallery, the circuit judge stood at absolute, rigid attention and delivered a formal civilian salute. But before I tell you why this state judge, a man who held absolute power in this county, was trembling at the vertical sight of my dress uniform, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Because what happened next, nobody in that gallery saw coming. But to explain why a state judge was standing like a raw recruit before a woman in a faded gray coat, I need to take you back to where the noise began. My name is Victoria. I am 54 years old. If you saw me walking through the supermarket in Clarksville, or loading bags of mulch into the back of an old, dented sedan, you wouldn't look twice. I wear plain, functional clothes, mostly soft wool sweaters and a faded gray trench coat I bought at an exchange a decade ago. I live in a modest, single-story brick cottage, 5 miles outside the perimeter of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Every morning, when the winter chill settles into the valley, my left knee gives off a dull, sharp ache. It is a small physical reminder of a hard helicopter landing in the Bavarian hills during a midnight storm 20 years ago. I don't complain about it. I don't talk about the past to the neighbors who see me trimming the small fern near my front porch, to the local community, and to the small circle of distant relatives who occasionally checked in. I was simply an unmarried woman. They thought I had spent my youth hidden away in the dry, bureaucratic machinery of the federal government. They thought I returned home with nothing but a small pension and a quiet demeanor. They saw my simple life as evidence of an ordinary career that had yielded no grand riches or social standing. I let them believe it. There is a profound comfort in being invisible. After enough years spent dealing with things that alter the course of national security, attention becomes exhausting. Modesty isn't a lack of resources. It is a deliberate choice. Power doesn't need to bark. It doesn't need to wear its credentials on its sleeve to feel verified. I never corrected their assumptions because I wanted to see exactly how people treat someone they believe has absolutely nothing to offer them. And for a long time, Meredith and her associates treated me exactly like that. They saw me as a blank ledger they could use to write their own stories of superiority. But my silence was never an invitation. It was a perimeter line, and they had no idea they were about to cross it. With a heavy boot. The pattern began long before the courtroom ever existed. It was rooted deeply in the way Meredith viewed the very concept of family. To her, life was not a series of shared moments or quiet bonds. It was a loud, aggressive performance of status, measured strictly by immediate financial display and the envy of her suburban neighbors. When my father passed away, he left behind a small, respectable estate, built on decades of honest blue-collar labor. It was meant to secure her twilight years, to provide a steady, quiet safety net. Instead, she viewed it as a sudden windfall, a license to fund an opulent lifestyle in an exclusive development she could never truly maintain on her own. Within 4 years, the capital was drained. It was liquidated into custom marble countertops, leasing fees for German luxury vehicles, and lavish, performative dinner parties designed to scream wealth to a community that didn't care. When the inheritance ran dry, she didn't look inward. She didn't scale back. Instead, she turned her eyes toward me. She didn't see a daughter who had spent decades serving her country. She saw an unexploited asset that refused to be liquidated. 11 months ago, I drove down to her house in Ohio. I didn't make the 3-hour trip because I expected warmth or a sudden burst of maternal affection. I went because my phone had been bombarded for 3 days straight, with frantic, histrionic text messages regarding dire, immediate financial emergencies that threatened to put her on the street. I arrived in my ordinary civilian clothes. I wore a heavy navy sweater, plain denim, and my faded gray trench coat. In my pocket, I carried that old Swiss military stopwatch, its weight a familiar anchor against my thigh. I also carried my small leather coin purse, containing the jagged piece of brass shrapnel from my early field days. The house was suffocatingly grand, a monument to bad investments and desperate pride. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting sharp, fractured reflections onto velvet furniture. The air smelled faintly of expensive jasmine perfume and heavy, unpayable debt. Meredith sat on her plush sofa, her posture rigid. Her eyes immediately scanned me from my flat, salt-stained winter shoes to my short, unpolished fingernails. Within 3 seconds, her face settled into that familiar, polished mask of condescension, the first wave of contempt. She set her delicate porcelain teacup down. With a sharp, deliberate click against an ornate silver serving tray resting on the glass coffee table. It was a practiced gesture of aristocratic disappointment. But as she shifted the tray, a bright crimson corner of a document slid out from underneath the polished silver. It was a stark, final past-due foreclosure notice from a regional bank. Her manicured fingers flicked frantically, instantly shoving the crimson paper back out of sight with a desperate, trembling speed. Her class anxiety was a loud, terrifyingly fragile thing, hollow to the core. It was hidden beneath layers of stolen luxury and borrowed time. "Look at you, Victoria," she sneered. Her voice was dripping with artificial pity as she leaned back into her velvet cushions. "Stiff, dry, wasting your entire youth in those drab government offices. While I am forced to manage this family legacy entirely alone. A real daughter, a daughter with an ounce of gratitude, would have signed her portion of the estate over years ago, instead of hoarding a small, selfish civil service salary while her mother drowns." I didn't answer. I didn't point out the glaring contradiction of her lifestyle. I didn't remind her that I had quietly wired $47,000 of my own savings over the last 18 months alone. I did it just to clear her undisclosed credit lines and keep her utilities from being shut off. I didn't tell her that her bills were the predictable result of high-interest predatory loans, guided by local financial sharks who smelled her desperation from a mile away. I sat perfectly steady, my hands folded. I watched the small second hand of my mechanical stopwatch tick dryly on the glass table between us. I let her talk. Then, the study door opened, and Sterling stepped out into the living room. He was the chosen executor of her demands. He was a slick, regional attorney, with a reputation for bleeding family estates dry under the guise of local probate law. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and heavy gold rings that caught the light of the chandelier. He had a practiced, predatory smile that was entirely empty. He carried a thick manila folder, tapping it against his palm with an aggressive, rhythmic click, before laying it flat on the glass table, right next to my ticking stopwatch. "It's a simple adult maintenance agreement, Victoria," Sterling said. His voice was smooth, professional, and entirely hollow. He emphasized my first name, deliberately ignoring the uniform or the history behind my life. He was treating me like an uneducated clerk. "Your mother requires a guaranteed, legally binding monthly transfer of 60% of your federal allocation and retirement accounts. If you refuse to sign it today, we will be forced to make your lack of family loyalty very public. A government worker's reputation is a fragile, easily broken thing. Victoria, let's not make this uncomfortable for your career." They believed my silence was fear. They believed that because I didn't argue, because I didn't scream or cry out in self-defense, I was trapped by their legal jargon and social leverage. I didn't touch the heavy gold pen he pushed across the table. I simply stood up with deliberate military precision, picked up my mechanical stopwatch, put my gray trench coat back on, and walked out into the cool evening air without saying a single word. Behind me, as the heavy oak door failed to click shut, Meredith's voice rose to a shrill, unhinged scream. It echoed off the expensive brick facade of her neighborhood. Shouting that I was a monster, I let her scream. 2 weeks later, the tactical pressure intensified. She didn't keep it private. She chose my aunt's silver wedding anniversary. This was a major family gathering of over 40 extended relatives, held at a grand, brightly lit banquet hall in downtown Columbus. I arrived straight from a grueling 48-hour technical operational briefing at Fort Campbell. I was still wearing my civilian trench coat over my standard travel clothes. My body was exhausted. My left knee was throbbing with that old, familiar ache from the Bavarian hills. Meredith didn't wait for the dinner to begin. She intercepted me the exact moment I stepped into the absolute center of the grand hall, right beneath the massive crystal chandeliers. She ensured her voice boomed loudly enough for every aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend to freeze mid-sentence. "Here she is," she cried out. Her eyes widened with a terrifyingly accurate display of manufactured heartbreak. As she threw her hands in the air, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Our big, brave federal worker. Our cold, ungrateful daughter. She watches her own flesh and blood drown in debt, watches her mother struggle to survive, while she hides her massive government money away in secret accounts. She cares more about her obscure federal benefits and her precious career than the family that bled for her." The room erupted into an immediate cascade of whispers. Aunts and uncles, I hadn't spoken to since childhood, shook their heads in synchronized disgust, casting sharp, judgmental glances at my plain coat and unadorned appearance. They saw an isolated, defensive woman taking social blows. They saw a greedy child hoarding wealth. Sterling stood just a few feet behind her, loudly snapping his fingers to summon a waiter for champagne. He was smoothly sliding his professional card into the pockets of my wealthy cousins, quietly validating every lie Meredith spun as a tragic legal reality. I never corrected that assumption. I stood perfectly still in the absolute center of that hostile room, my breathing perfectly even, my spine aligned like a steel rod. I didn't offer a defense. I didn't scream back. Instead, my hand simply slipped deep into my coat pocket. My fingers quietly pressed onto the sharp, metallic edge of the brass shrapnel inside my coin purse, using the physical sting to lock myself in the present moment. They thought they were dominating the room. They didn't see that every false accusation, every fabricated debt document, and every public statement was being filed away into a specific, systematic federal matrix. They had no idea that they were building this matrix entirely with their own mouths. The final line was crossed 3 months later, when the formal, Certified legal summons arrived at my cottage doorstep near Fort Campbell. Meredith and Sterling hadn't just expanded their threats, they had finalized their design. They had filed a massive, multi-count civil lawsuit in the county circuit court. They were demanding an emergency court-ordered asset disclosure, a freeze on my personal banking, and a mandatory parental support order, backed by the full authority of the state judiciary. They didn't just want a portion of my income anymore. They wanted a full, public execution of my privacy. They wanted to use the local court system to rip open my service file and humiliate me before the local press syndicates Sterling had carefully primed. When I opened the heavy legal envelope, the sharp cardboard edge cutting my finger, my left knee gave a small, sharp throb. I sat down at my small wooden kitchen table, entirely alone. I looked out the pristine glass window at the heavy gray rain, pouring relentlessly over the dark Kentucky fields. The weather had turned incredibly harsh. The sky matched the cold, clinical reality of the trap they had set. They didn't realize they were calculating against a wall of numbers they couldn't breach. They were facing 32 years of unblemished federal service and 11 straight months of tactical cryptographic surveillance. They didn't account for the $47,000 of my own cleared capital, used as bait. They thought they were filing a simple local complaint, but they had just stepped directly into a trap. It was engineered over 700 days of continuous observation. Training took over. Instantaneous, quiet, and absolute. It was not anger. It was not a desire for primitive revenge. It was just training. For over 30 years, the United States military had trained me to master the art of strategic patience. They had taught me never to intercept an enemy. When they are in the middle of making a catastrophic mistake, you let them advance. You let them build their lines, deploy their artillery, and expand their confidence until they are completely out of position. You wait until they are entirely exposed, with a massive, unbreachable wall behind them, and absolutely no avenue of retreat. Meredith and Sterling believed they were playing a high-stakes game of small-town influence, local judicial relationships, and emotional leverage. They truly believed that because they controlled the local narrative, they controlled the outcome. They had absolutely no idea that they had just marched directly into a federal theater, where their local judges, their political handshakes, and their state statutes meant absolutely nothing. I stood up, walked to my study, and opened my locked leather briefcase using the heavy 5-digit digital security code. Inside, beneath standard civilian retirement projections, lay the actual, classified reality of my life. There were hundreds of pages of federal logs, encrypted wire intercepts, and bank summaries that had never been seen by a state circuit court. For the past 24 months, my active unit at Fort Campbell, the United States Army JAG Corps' Federal Special Investigations Division, had been quietly, systematically tracking a massive regional network. They were investigating bank fraud, identity theft, and asset hiding that involved the exploitation of veterans' benefits and the forgery of federal financial allotment signatures. Sterling's firm wasn't a surprise to us. His primary escrow accounts were already flagged on our secondary investigation grid. But by filing this public civil lawsuit, by attaching forged federal allotment documents with my stolen signature to the public state record to prove my financial capability, they hadn't just filed a lawsuit, they had tripped a highly sensitive federal wire. They had brought the stolen assets directly into a public forum. This finalized the exact jurisdiction my unit needed to drop the hammer. I reached down, picked up my encrypted satellite phone, and dialed a secure line directly into the federal command sector at Fort Campbell. The line clicked 3 times before Chief Investigator Vance picked up. His voice came through the speaker crisp, cold, and entirely devoid of human emotion. "Colonel," Vance said, his voice level. "The State Circuit Court database just updated. Sterling's team has officially entered the forged federal documents into the public record to support their motion for emergency discovery. They just finalized the link. The trap is closed." "Good," I replied, my eyes fixed on the gray rain hitting the glass pane. Proceed with the sealed delivery via the Federal Marshal Service. Let the state proceeding begin exactly as scheduled. I will be present in full dress uniform. The morning of the hearing was remarkably clear. The rain from the previous night left the air sharp and cold. I dressed with meticulous care. I did not put on my civilian sweater. I reached into the back of the cedar wardrobe and pulled out my pristine, midnight blue U.S. Army service uniform. I pinned the heavy silver eagles onto the stiff shoulders. I aligned the ribbons, each one representing decades of silent, federal enforcement in sectors these people didn't even know existed. I picked up the black leather briefcase with the heavy digital lock, slipped my stopwatch into my pocket, and drove to the county courthouse. When I arrived, the courthouse corridor was already buzzing. Sterling had kept his promise. 2 local reporters with cameras were stationed near the double doors. As I walked past them, my boots clicking sharply against the marble floor, Sterling looked up from his notes. A smug smile crossed his face as he saw the uniform. To him, the dress blues weren't a sign of power. They were a prop he could use to maximize the drama of his public victory. "Going for the patriotic defense, Colonel?" Sterling whispered as I took my seat at the empty table. "It won't change the numbers. State law allows for asset verification. By noon, your entire federal file will be a matter of public record." Meredith sat beside him, adjusted her expensive gold necklace, and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. "You brought this on yourself, Victoria," she said loudly enough for the gallery to hear. "Playing the big officer in your little uniform, but you couldn't even fulfill a basic daughter's duty. Let's see what your military superiors think when they see your greed exposed in a court of law." I did not answer. I placed my briefcase flat on the table, pulled out the old Swiss stopwatch, set it next to the leather, and folded my hands. The low tick, tick, tick of the gears maintained a relentless, steady tempo, completely unaffected by the noise around it. I waited for the clock to strike 11. The hearing opened with a flurry of noise. Sterling took the well of the court, his voice booming through the sound system as he painted a theatrical picture. He described an aging mother left to rot by an elite, high-earning federal officer. He flourished the forged asset transfer forms, holding them up toward Judge Henderson. "We are asking this court for immediate seizure and verification," Sterling shouted, his face flushed with the performance. "This uniform she wears cannot shield her from her civil obligations." Judge Henderson leaned forward, looking down at me with a heavy frown. "Colonel," he said, his voice heavy, "the evidence presented against your character and financial conduct is severe. Do you have anything to present before I rule?" I stood up with perfect posture. The room went entirely silent, waiting for a desperate plea or an angry outburst. I said nothing. I simply looked down at the mechanical dial on my table. 10:15 a.m. Right on time. At that exact second, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a sharp, violent crack. 2 tall, imposing men in charcoal federal suits walked down the center aisle with absolute, unhurried authority. The lead agent carried a thick, snow-white envelope sealed with heavy red wax, bearing the gold emblem of the Department of Defense. Sterling spun around, his face tightening. "Your Honor, I object to this highly irregular disruption. This is a state civil proceeding." The lead agent bypassed the bar completely, stepped up to the bench, and placed the envelope directly onto Judge Henderson's desk. "Federal mandate, Your Honor," the agent said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Sealed under the Federal Industrial Security Act. Read it immediately." Judge Henderson took the envelope and broke the red wax seal. The room dropped into absolute, frozen stillness, as if a glass ornament had shattered silently against the floor. On my table, at that exact millisecond, the old mechanical military stopwatch cut out completely. Its internal gears froze into total, absolute stillness. Not a single tick remained. As the judge's eyes scanned the first page, the arrogance completely vanished from his face. The color drained from his skin until he looked like a corpse. He looked straight at me, his hands trembling violently, as he forced himself to read the explicit federal attachment orders out loud. Pursuant to Federal Warrant DX 904, Judge Henderson read, his voice cracking with immense panic. This court recognizes the immediate freeze of Techcom Trust escrow account, ending in 412, valued at $412,000, and the immediate federal asset forfeiture of the residential property located at Sector 9, valued at $780,000, linked to systemic interstate fraud. This civil action has been identified as a deliberate attempt to compromise a federal officer during an active criminal investigation into regional bank fraud. The local file is dismissed with prejudice. Jurisdiction is seized by the federal government. The judge stopped, pushed his chair back, stood at rigid attention, and delivered a formal civilian salute toward me. The entire gallery gasped. Meredith jumped out of her chair, her face contorted with panic. What is the meaning of this? She's just my daughter. She doesn't have that kind of power. The lead agent turned toward her, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his jacket. Meredith, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to extort a federal officer, and identity theft involving military accounts. Take her. Before Sterling could even close his mouth, the second agent stepped behind him, pinning his arms back with a swift, practiced movement. Sterling's expensive leather briefcase slipped from his grip, falling to the floor with a heavy thud, bursting open and scattering hundreds of fraudulent local files across the polished wood. Mr. Sterling, the agent said coldly, your escrow accounts were completely frozen by federal warrant at 10:50 a.m. this morning. You are being detached to federal custody. I sat back down at the defense table. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a single word of triumph. I watched calmly as Meredith wept, screaming my name as she was led down the center aisle in steel cuffs. Her status was completely shattered before the very reporters she had invited to witness my ruin. The universe was simply correcting itself around me. The courtroom emptied within minutes, leaving only the fallen papers and the quiet hum of the fan. I stood up, locked my briefcase with a single click, picked up my frozen stopwatch, and walked out the side exit into the bright, silent afternoon. There was no grand confrontation left to be had. The Connerst, and the mother who had used her, had already been measured by the cold arithmetic of federal law. The indictment seized exactly $1.2 million in hidden assets from Sterling's firm. The suburban house Meredith had used as her fortress of status was forfeited to the state within 90 days. 12 years passed. Governments changed, ranks advanced, and the noisy drama of that small county courtroom became nothing more than a faint, distant footnote in a lifetime defined by quiet duty. I stood on the tarmac at the Fort Campbell airfield one final morning. The sky was a beautiful, vast canvas of deep orange and soft purple as the sun began to break over the horizon. A massive C-17 transport plane sat quietly in the distance, its engines cooling down. I was no longer wearing the midnight blue uniform. I wore my old, faded gray trench coat, the exact same coat Meredith had once mocked as a sign of poverty. A young officer approached me, snapped an immaculate salute, and took my bag with deep reverence, whispering, "The transport is ready, General." I smiled faintly, my values entirely unchanged. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the small leather coin purse, and looked at the heavy piece of brass shrapnel one last time. My left knee gave off a tiny, familiar ache. But for the first time in my life, there was no weight attached to it. Meredith had passed away in a federal facility 5 years prior, still dreaming of wealth she could never hold. I turned away from the airfield and walked toward the waiting transport vehicle. As the sun broke fully over the horizon, washing the entire frame in a warm, brilliant white light, the world was entirely still, and the silence inside me was absolute. We spend so much of our lives believing that we must scream to be heard. We are told that if we do not display our value, if we do not wear our achievements like armor, the world will assume we have nothing. We watch loud people dominate rooms, building empires out of arrogance and false assumptions. They treat our silence as weakness, and our modesty as a lack of worth. But the truth is far more constant. Real strength doesn't need to perform. It doesn't need a gallery to validate its existence. And it never needs to explain itself to people who only understand life through the prism of contempt. When you know exactly who you are, when your worth is anchored in something deeper than public narrative, you can sit quietly through the storm. You can let them believe whatever they want, because you know that truth is an old, patient clock. It always strikes right on time. If you are going through a season where your silence is being tested, where people are dismissing everything you've sacrificed because you choose not to boast, remember that the quietest rivers always carve the deepest canyons. Let them talk. Let them believe you have nothing. Keep your spine straight, your heart steady, and let reality do the work for you. When that courtroom door opened 12 years ago, Meredith realized too late that my call sign, Nemesis, didn't mean vengeance. It simply meant that the truth will always return to collect its balance, no matter how loudly you try to deny it. If this story meant something to you, and if you believe that silent honor will always outlast the loudest noise, hit that like button and share it with someone who may need this reminder today.